The rain poured relentlessly as I stumbled down the empty road, soaked to the bone and clutching my worn backpack, the only thing left from my old life. My parents' screams still echoed in my head. "Get out! Don't ever come back!" My twin sister Olivia had watched silently, her arms crossed, her face devoid of emotion. No protests, no last-minute mercy, just cold detachment. I had nowhere to go. At 16, I was alone. My world reduced to this cracked, desolate road and a few soggy bills stuffed into my pocket. Hunger twisted my stomach, but despair hit harder. I walked until exhaustion dragged me down into the muddy ditch by the roadside. Curling into a ball, I let the rain soak through my clothes, too numb to care. Morning came with no promise of warmth or safety. I forced myself up and kept walking, driven by instinct. The nearest town, a small, forgotten place called Cedar Hollow, was miles away. The old stories about its decaying buildings and strange disappearances played in my mind. But fear of the unknown was better than certain death in the cold. By nightfall, I reached Cedar Hollow's outskirts, where rusted cars and sagging homes lined empty streets. The entire place seemed frozen in time, as though the world had forgotten it existed. I spotted a worn convenience store with flickering neon letters that read, "Hollow Mart." Hunger pushed me inside. The air inside smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. A thin, wiry man with a scruffy beard sat behind the counter, watching me with narrowed eyes. His name tag read Earl. I kept my head down, grabbed a can of beans, and fished out the crumpled dollars from my pocket. Earl's eyes tracked every movement. "That all?" he rasped. His voice sounded like gravel being ground underfoot. "Yeah." He rang up the beans, but his stare lingered like he was memorizing my face. "Stay outta trouble," he warned, sliding the can toward me. "Kids like you don't last long round here." I nodded and hurried out, heart pounding. As I rounded the corner of the store, I found an abandoned service alley littered with garbage and broken crates. It would have to do. I slumped against the wall and pried open the can, devouring the cold beans with trembling hands. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and distant footstep sent jolts of fear through me. Cedar Hollow was more than just eerie. It felt like it was watching me. Days passed in a blur of hunger and sleeplessness. I scoured dumpsters, avoided Earl's store, and camped in the hollow remains of a burned-out house. Survival dulled everything but the primal need to stay alive. One night, while searching for scraps behind a shuttered diner, I heard a soft rustling. I froze. The dim streetlight flickered as shadows shifted at the alley's edge. My breath hitched. Someone's there. Before I could run, a figure emerged. A teenage girl around my age with sharp eyes and tangled dark hair, wearing a patched leather jacket 2 sizes too big. She held up her hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I'm not here to mug you." Her voice was steady but edged with caution. "Name's June." "You?" I hesitated. "Lucas." She studied me, weighing something. "You hungry?" I nodded warily. June reached into her coat and pulled out a half-eaten sandwich, tossing it toward me. Desperation won over suspicion, and I grabbed it, devouring the stale bread. "You're new," she observed, arms crossed. "Bad place to be alone." I swallowed hard. "Got kicked out." She nodded like she understood. "Follow me. If you want to survive in this dump, you'll need more than luck." I should have walked away. Trusting strangers was dangerous. But loneliness gnawed at me worse than hunger. I followed her into the dark. June led me to an old train yard on the town's edge, where rusted freight cars sat forgotten under a web of tangled vines. She slid open one of the least decayed cars, revealing a makeshift shelter filled with old blankets, a scavenged mattress, and a few crates of supplies. "Home sweet home," she said dryly. "Don't touch my stuff, and we won't have problems." It wasn't an invitation, it was a warning. But it was warmer than the streets. I dropped my pack by the corner and sank onto the mattress, exhaustion pulling me under. Weeks passed, and I adapted to life in the forgotten shadows of Cedar Hollow. June was street-smart and ruthless, but there was something protective beneath her hardened exterior. We scouted the abandoned parts of town, scavenging supplies and staying ahead of the gangs that ruled the streets after dark. One night, as we returned from a supply run, June stiffened, her eyes narrowing at the train yard's entrance. "Someone's been here." I followed her gaze. The freight car door hung slightly ajar. Inside, our makeshift shelter was ransacked. Blankets tossed aside, supplies gone. "Stay back," June hissed, drawing a rusty knife from her belt. We moved silently through the wreckage. My heart hammered in my chest, every shadow stretching into something dangerous. Suddenly, a low, mocking voice echoed from the shadows. Well, well, look what we have here." From behind a rusted crate stepped Nick, the last person I ever expected to see again. He hadn't changed much since the day he'd helped drive me out of my parents' house. His smirk was as venomous as ever, though now his face was scarred and meaner, hardened by something darker. "Miss me, Lucas?" Nick sneered. "You're a hard kid to track down, but not hard enough." June shifted protectively in front of me, her knife gleaming under the moonlight. "What do you want?" I demanded, voice steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. Nick grinned, spreading his arms. "What's mine?" The freight car door slammed shut behind us, locking us in. We were trapped. Nick's smirk burned into my memory like an old scar being torn open. He circled us slowly, savoring the fear he thought he saw. My fists clenched, but June's sharp glance kept me still. Acting rashly would get us both killed. "Didn't think I'd run into you in a dump like this," Nick sneered. "Thought you'd crawl back home by now." My throat tightened. Home wasn't an option, not after what he'd done. "What do you want?" I forced out, keeping my voice steady. Nick tilted his head, mockingly thoughtful. "What do I want?" He snapped his fingers. "Oh right, you owe me." "We don't owe you anything," June shot back. His eyes gleamed with interest. "Who's this, Lucas?" "Your little guard dog." Before I could move, Nick's two lackeys emerged from the shadows, blocking the freight car's exit. June stiffened but kept her knife low, ready to strike if needed. "You took everything from me?" I said, keeping my voice calm despite the fire burning inside. Nick laughed, a cold, soulless sound. "You did that to yourself the day you ran." I stepped forward. "Then why track me down?" He grinned wider. "Because your past isn't as dead as you think." Before I could respond, he jerked his head toward the crates. His goons moved fast, knocking over boxes and sending canned goods clattering across the metal floor. Supplies we couldn't afford to lose. "Back off," June growled, lunging forward. But Nick raised a gun, stopping her in her tracks. "Easy there," he cooed, as though calming a stray dog. "Wouldn't want this to end messy." I raised my hands slowly, mind racing for a way out. "You've made your point. Just take what you want and go." Nick shook his head. "Not this time." His smirk widened. "You're coming with me." They tied my hands and forced me outside, rain soaking through my clothes. June fought hard but was overpowered, knocked unconscious and left behind. My stomach twisted at the sight of her crumpled form in the mud, but fighting back would get us both killed. Nick's men shoved me into a battered van with duct-taped windows. The doors slammed, locking me into darkness. My mind churned, replaying every moment leading up to this trap. Why now? Why me? The van jolted into motion, tires skidding on the slick pavement. I pressed my ear to the metal wall, straining to hear anything useful. Nick's voice cut through the pounding rain. "You sure he's worth the trouble?" one of the goons asked. Nick snorted. "You think I came all this way for him? He's just leverage." Leverage? Against who? My parents were broke and Olivia was... My blood ran cold. Olivia. Nick was after her. Hours passed before the van finally screeched to a halt. The doors flew open, and rough hands dragged me out into the freezing air. We were deep in the woods, far from Cedar Hollow. An abandoned hunting lodge loomed ahead, its windows shattered and roof sagging like a forgotten grave. They hauled me inside, tossing me onto the splintered wooden floor. Pain shot through my ribs as I hit the ground. Nick strolled in casually, wiping rain from his scarred face. "Welcome home," he said mockingly. Missed me? I spat blood onto the floor. You think this makes you powerful? He crouched down, his face inches from mine. I don't need power. His grin widened. I just need her. Olivia. He was after her, and he thought using me would draw her in. He didn't know how wrong he was. Days blurred together in the freezing lodge. They kept me tied to a rusty chair, feeding me just enough to keep me alive. Nick would visit daily, taunting me with stories of how he'd found Olivia, or was about to. Each word was a dagger, twisting deeper. I had no idea if Olivia was safe, or if she even remembered I existed. Part of me hoped she'd forgotten. She deserved a better life, far away from this nightmare. One night, as the wind howled outside, Nick stormed into the lodge, seething with rage. His men trailed behind, bruised and battered. She's gone, Nick snarled. Left before we got there. My heart pounded with relief, though I kept my expression neutral. Nick kicked over a crate, sending shattered glass across the floor. But she'll come looking for you, he hissed. Family always comes back. Eventually. Days later, I was woken by muffled voices outside, faint but growing closer. My pulse raced. Rescue or something worse. Suddenly, the front door burst open with a deafening crack. Chaos erupted as Nick's men shouted and scattered. A flash of movement caught my eye. June, soaked and bloodied but alive, wielding a crowbar like a weapon forged from fury. She swung hard, taking down the nearest thug with brutal precision. Get up, she shouted, tossing me a knife. Adrenaline surged as I sliced through the ropes binding my wrists. Nick's shout echoed through the crumbling lodge, but I was already moving. We fought through the maze of broken furniture and shattered memories until we burst into the icy night. Gunshots rang out, splintering trees as we sprinted toward the darkened forest. Footsteps thundered behind us, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. Branches tore at my arms, mud sucked at my feet, but the promise of freedom drove us forward. Finally, the sounds of pursuit faded into the howling wind. We collapsed near a rocky outcrop, gasping for air. Blood trickled down June's temple, but she grinned through the pain. Thought you could use a rescue, she panted. I managed a weak laugh, though my mind remained fixed on one thought. Olivia was still out there, still in danger, and I wasn't done fighting yet. The freezing air bit into my skin as we crouched beneath the tangled canopy of trees. The adrenaline still surged through my veins, making every breath ragged. June pressed a shaky hand against a deep gash on her arm, wincing. I ripped off a strip of my already ruined shirt and tied it tightly around the wound. We can't stay here, I whispered, straining to hear any signs of pursuit. The wind howled through the twisted branches, masking distant noises that could have been footsteps, or just the restless forest. June nodded grimly, her usual sharp defiance dulled by exhaustion. What now? My thoughts raced. Nick would regroup, and this time he wouldn't just be hunting me. He wanted Olivia, and he wouldn't stop until he had her. I couldn't let that happen. We head back to Cedar Hollow, I said, jaw clenched. We find Olivia before he does. The journey back felt endless. Days blurred into nights as we moved through the unforgiving wilderness. Hunger gnawed at my insides, and sleep came only in fractured bursts, haunted by images of Nick's cruel smile. June pushed through the pain in stoic silence, never complaining, even when her limp grew worse. When we finally emerged near Cedar Hollow's outskirts, relief battled with dread. The town looked even more decayed than before, as though the rotting buildings themselves sensed the coming storm. June leaned heavily against me, her breath ragged. Where would she go? I searched my fractured memories. Olivia had always talked about running away, but there was one place she'd been drawn to, a half-abandoned cabin on the far side of the lake where we used to hide as kids, a place even Nick might overlook. We checked the old cabin, I said. If she's not there, we improvise. We reached the lake by nightfall. The cabin stood dark and silent, its weather-beaten walls half swallowed by creeping ivy. Memories tugged at me. Olivia's laughter echoing across the water, our secret world untouched by betrayal. Stay here, I whispered to June, helping her sit against a tree. I'll check inside. She caught my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Be careful. I nodded and crept toward the cabin, heart pounding in my chest. Every creak of the wooden steps beneath my feet felt deafening. The front door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. I stepped inside. Dust blanketed every surface, and the air smelled of damp wood and forgotten time. Faint footprints in the dirt-streaked floor led deeper into the cabin. I followed them cautiously, knife drawn. A floorboard groaned behind me. I spun just as a shadow lunged from the darkness. We crashed to the ground, my knife skittering out of reach. I grappled with my attacker, my mind already screaming Nick. But as I twisted free, moonlight illuminated her face. Olivia. Lucas? She gasped, her wide, frightened eyes locking onto mine. My breath hitched. She looked fragile, haunted, as though life had drained every ounce of color from her. It's me, I whispered. You're safe. Her knees buckled, and I caught her before she hit the ground. For the first time in what felt like forever, I held my sister in my arms. We barely had time to exchange hurried explanations before the crunch of approaching footsteps shattered the fragile moment. Nick was here. Go, I hissed, shoving Olivia toward the back door. Take June and run. I'm not leaving you, Olivia protested, desperation in her voice. This isn't a choice. I snapped, grabbing my knife. Get her to safety. I'll hold them off. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, choking back a sob. Promise you'll find us. Go. She vanished into the night just as the front door splintered inward. Nick stormed in, flanked by his men, shadows twisting around him like a living nightmare. Lucas, he sneered, voice dripping with mockery. Did you really think you could run forever? No running this time, I growled, gripping the knife tighter. He circled me slowly, savoring the confrontation. You were always predictable. So noble, so pathetic. The first goon lunged, and the world exploded into violent chaos. Fists collided with bone. Blades gleamed in the dim light. Pain burned through me, but I fought like a cornered animal. Desperate, relentless, unyielding. Blood slicked my hands, but I refused to fall. Nick's men dropped one by one, leaving only him. Breathing hard, we faced each other, two wolves circling for the kill. His knife flashed in the moonlight, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. You'll never win, he spat, lunging forward. I sidestepped, driving my blade into his side. He gasped, stunned, but lashed out wildly, slashing across my ribs. Fire erupted in my chest, but I didn't let go. I twisted the knife deeper until his strength finally gave out. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, blood pooling beneath him. Should have stayed gone, he rasped, hatred burning in his dying eyes. I staggered back, collapsing against the shattered wall as darkness closed in. I woke hours later, half buried in rubble, the cabin eerily silent. Pain surged through every nerve, but I forced myself up, stumbling through the wreckage toward the woods. Rain lashed against my broken body, washing away blood and ash. Every step felt like climbing a mountain, but I had to keep moving. They were still out there, waiting, hoping. At the edge of the forest, just before consciousness slipped away, I saw a flicker of light, soft and warm. Figures running toward me. Olivia, June, alive, safe. I collapsed into their arms as the storm finally broke overhead. Weeks later, I stood on a lonely hill overlooking the forgotten remains of Cedar Hollow. The past was buried, along with Nick and all the ghosts that had haunted me. Olivia and June were safe, building something new far from this cursed place. As for me, I was finally free. The world stretched endlessly before me, full of possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. And this time, I was ready to live. Enjoyed the twists and turns? Hit the like button and explore more thrilling stories on our channel.